here. So it's your pleasure to be here once again. My name is Kire Babanoski. I come from Skopje, North Macedonia. Back in 2019, I was a participant of the third Young Researcher Workshop in called Haifa, but also now it's a very good opportunity and very good pleasure to be here in also beautiful Salzburg. My presentation back then in Haifa focused on the threat of foreign terrorist fighters to the European security. But now for this workshop, I decided to delve a little bit deeper and to explore more about the deradicalization programs in some European countries and their role in supporting the rehabilitation, reintegration, resocialization processes for the convicted individuals. Why foreign terrorist fighters or FTF? Because they are serious security phenomenon that possess societal concern and therefore attract scientific interest. Due to different motivational factors such as ideology, relation, kinship, or finances, many of them are radicalized and decide to go to the battlefields. And when they come back to their home country, some of them are caught by the security institutions, processed through the judicial system, but some of them are free. That's why, because they have their radical values, the battle experience, military skills, and established contacts, they pose a significant risk to society. Many deradicalization programs or reintegration models or concepts or approaches or interventions, whatever we call them, I will speak about that later as well, were developed to reduce the risk of re-engagement in violent extremist activities. These programs were introduced and implemented in different European countries and contexts as well, but their effectiveness varies depending on the country, on the context in the country, on the target population, and are influenced by different types of factors. The objectives of this research was to analyze the progress of these programs, as I mentioned, because they are important elements of counterterrorism, through the evaluation and assessment of their effectiveness, to identify the critical factors for ensuring these programs are productive and sustainable in the long term. When studying these types of programs in European prisons, it is important also to consider several questions that you can see here on this slide. For example, what types of expertise, efforts, and interventions are invested in the deradicalization program, and when do they yield results? What parameters are best suited to evaluating their success and failure? And do these programs demonstrate flexibility and adaptability to local context? And do they contribute to enhancing individual capacities and their resilience against the influence of violent extremism? I try to find some answers and to draw some conclusions and also recommendations from the literature review, also from the analysis, but also from several interviews that I conducted with theoreticians, with experts who work on this field, in order to assess the existing deradicalization programs in the European countries, and to identify some best practices and recommendations, as I mentioned, and how they can contribute to the development of some common elements for designing effective and sustainable programs. Although we'll see that the flexible approach is maybe the better, because there is no one-size-fits-all approach that can be also implementable and applicable to every and different types of context. This research or this paper, which is also a draft paper in draft, does not address interventions or intervention tools aimed at preventing engagement in violent extremist activities within at-risk population in society at large. But it focuses mostly on the population in the prison and after they are released from prison, when they are prison. First of all, in order to understand these concepts of deradicalization and so on, I will start with introducing the general concepts of radicalization, then deradicalization, disengagement, and exit. For example, most of the definitions currently in circulation describe radicalization as a process or processes whereby individuals or groups come to approve of and ultimately participate in the use of violence for political aim. Some authors refer to violent radicalization in order to emphasize the violent outcome and differentiate the process from non-violent forms of radical thinking. But some of them think of or see this process as a gradual process that requires a progression through distinct stages and happens either quickly or easily. That means that a person does not become radical overnight. However, there are some events or incidents throughout their life that may act as a catalyst event and which can accelerate this process. There are different types of causes. For example, the family, societal, individual causes, but also push and pull factors that can influence someone to be radicalized and get into the extremism and violent extremism. And they are numerous and complex, but they're not subject to analysis of this paper. As I mentioned, only the deradicalization program. Now we are coming to the concept of deradicalization, which is sometimes described as a practice of encouraging those with extreme and violent religious or political ideologies, mostly, to adopt more moderate views. Or some authors refer to the methods and techniques employed to undermine and reverse the process of complete radicalization, and thereby reducing the potential risk to society from terrorism. It's interesting that many authors distinguish between collective and individual deradicalization or disengagement processes, depending on whether this process is led by or aimed at individuals or the entire groups or as a collective. Then we're coming to the other concepts like disengagement or exit. And as I mentioned, deradicalization as a process refers to the shifting the mindset and thinking. But when we're talking about the process which requires more behavioral, like abstaining from violence, or practical changes like work, housing, and school, then the most appropriate concept or term is disengagement. Also, there is another concept which is exit or exit strategies or exit intervention or exit program. And this concept combines both of them, the deradicalization and disengagement, which means it's a little bit broader, let's say. But when we're talking about the rehabilitation, resocialization, and I add here also the reintegration, they all refer more to the goal of a process of deradicalization, but also disengagement or exit. Regarding the exit strategies, there are two main approaches or two directions. The first one focuses on the prison environment, where the returnees are serving their sentences, and this is where I focused more when I was researching. And the second one was about the non-custodial environment, which includes those who are released and not on probation, those prosecuted but found not guilty, and those who have not been caught, prosecuted, or convicted yet. There is one organization, Radicalization Awareness Network. They work more on the exit strategies, and they're exploring these types of exit strategies. And they concluded that these types of strategies mostly addressing the ideological dimension through techniques such as one-on-one counseling, mentoring, group dialogue sessions, or providing religious and spiritual support to the people who live. But also they emphasize the importance of reconnecting these types of persons with their families and also the broader social environment, offering psychological support, trauma intervention, as well as implementing different types of mentoring programs in order to connect them with mentors who will work with them while they're in prison, but also afterwards. the state and the entire society provide an appropriate response to this threat by designing and implementing programs designed for prisons aimed at diverting these types of individuals from the terrorist trajectory. State authorities must set the primary pillar and possess the necessary conditions, capabilities, and capacities as well for deradicalization, disengagement, and also resocialization, rehabilitation, reintegration, as I mentioned before. And here the coordination and cooperation among the different types of institutions, stakeholders, and actors within the state is very important, such as the judiciary, the intelligence, the penitentiary systems, but also the civil society and religious communities. That's why I said here that it's imperative that the state authorities find the right mix of responses, protect society, and also assist those who are willing to rehabilitate themselves. You will see later that many of these types of programs have success when there is a willingness by the prisoners to be engaged in such a program, and because they are motivated to rehabilitate themselves and to reintegrate later into the society. As I mentioned, a range of programs or models exist, which incorporating to various degrees psychological and counseling services, help with employment, education or housing, religious education, but also support to prisoners' families. Also, a variety of factors are involved in providing such services, from prison workers, then rehabilitation centers in the community, the religious and community leaders, psychiatrists, and in some cases, even the former militants can help with this process. But despite the promise of such programs, we still have lack of information about their evaluation, their assessment, and their success, because it's a little bit challenging to find out what are the results of these types of programs and how successful they are. Many times, the recidivism cases show that the success in deradicalization and disengagement programs is never guaranteed, which means that they were not successful, or maybe the other factors were also involved or included in it. I tried to find or identify some concerns or challenges with the implementation and applicability of these types of deradicalization programs. For example, determining the most appropriate placement for these individuals within the correctional system, within the building where they stay. Potential criminal contamination within the prison environment, with the risk of extremist ideology spreading among inmates and potentially leading to the radicalization of other prisoners. And also it's interesting that finding the right balance between security concerns and the goal of facilitating rehabilitation is a complex task that requires careful consideration and strategic decision making. Moreover, this dilemma extends beyond the walls of the penitentiary buildings, that the penitentiary system, and resonates deeply with correctional staff, policymakers, and also the experts in the field, like social workers, psychologists, security experts, and so on. Crucial question of what approach is most conducive to the rehabilitation and reintegration processes of these types of returnees becomes a central focus on the discussions lately, because these types of crimes, like participation in a foreign army or paramilitary formation, and the concept of foreign terrorist fighters were introduced in the last decade, let's say. The question of how to best accommodate these returnees within the prison system, balancing the needs of the security and also the aim of rehabilitation, remains a challenging and vital issue that continues to occupy the thoughts of many theoreticians in the literature, in the science, and efforts of those involved in the management of the penitentiary institution. We're talking about the regime of regimes for convicted terrorists and how they should be placed within the other community within the prison. Broadly, there are three types of regimes. The first one is placing all extremists together, which is the concentration model. Second one, dispersing them among the regular criminal population, dispersal one. And the third one is to isolate them from each other, but also from the rest of the criminal population in the penitentiary institutions. Although full and permanent isolation is illegal, prison services across Europe have experimented with different types of regimes, and the mixed approach has become increasingly popular, which involves concentrating or separating the most dangerous inmates while dispersing the remainder within the prison community. It's interesting that in their study, Basler and Neumann concluded that every type of prison regime involves trade-off. What works for one kind of extremist prisoner population may not necessarily be effective for another one. In their survey with 10 European countries, they concluded that in general, the flexible approach is maybe the best one. And it depends on various types of factors, like the conditions, the capacities they have in the prison centers, the prison communities, the training of their prison staff, and so on. That's why we can conclude that there is no single or perfect solution that can fit through all other, let's say, prison or penitentiary systems. Most of these deradicalization programs or rehabilitation plans are mix of interventions based on the offender's risk and his assessment. Usually all these programs start with these types of assessment, analysis, like psychosocial analysis of their background, their life, and so on. And after that, they're designing the plans, usually by a team of different professionals, including prison guards, prison governors, psychologists, staff running rehabilitative interventions, and so on. And usually some of these concepts, they're discussed with the offender in order to find out what is the best for them. Whether taking part in the intervention is voluntary or obligatory depends on the sentence conditions and on the prison policy. In general, practitioners believe that the voluntary participation will lead to better results with the deradicalization program, if there is a motivation factor in it. Taking into account the needs and wishes by the prisoners, expressed by the offenders, let's say, is also essential for the rehabilitation plan and how it will be developed later. Here I would like to say briefly about three interesting deradicalization programs. The first one is from the Netherlands, the second one is from Norway, and third one is from the UK. For example, in Netherlands, they started in 2012. They started to work on a plan to enhance the reintegration of extremist offenders. It was a collaboration intervention between the Dutch National Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism and the Dutch Probation Service. And this initiative aims to achieve three main objectives. First of all, to improve the reintegration efforts of terrorist prisoners while they are still incarcerated, to provide better post-release support, and to establish a centralized and coordinated approach for managing this specific group of offenders in the future. And since 2018, for example, they had around 200 clients, let's say, or people who were prisoners who were involved in this type of program. The program is very robust, and also the positive outcome or positive lesson or best good practice, let's say, from this program is that it includes internal with the external partners, sometimes including some stakeholders or actors outside of the penitentiary system who can also help with the support of this type of rehabilitation or reintegration. But when it comes to the evaluation or assessment of these types of programs, the results suggest that this initiative is based on a sound understanding of how and why individuals may de-radicalize or disengage from terrorism behaviorally, but that it continues to face serious challenges in terms of accurately defining success and systematically gathering objective indicators of its attainment. The second program is the Norwegian mentoring scheme, introduced in 2014, with the aim of addressing radicalization in prison, particularly among young detainees. They chose to emphasize mentoring relationships between inmates and civilian mentors, placing a strong emphasis on building trust, and also here, if there is willingness by the prison offenders, which means that the program will have results later on. The primary objective was not to immediately de-radicalize or disengage convicted terrorists or radicalized inmates, but rather to encourage them to gradually change their behavior, their mindset, their opinions, their views, and so on. Also, they did an evaluation in 2019, but still remain uncertain whether these types of schemes have achieved success in changing prisoners' behavior, prisoners' lifestyle, and reducing the risk of reoffending later on. This scheme was a relatively new challenge also for the country. The creators aim to blend existing knowledge of de-radicalization strategies and intervention used before in the country with an approach to inmate rehabilitation that aligns with the Norwegian correctional values later on. This approach involved questioning their radical ideologies and use of politically motivated violence and redirecting their focus towards their future role in society. In this regard, these types of programs or scheme, as they're calling it, resembles existing reintegration measures that aim to empower prisoners to change their lifestyle from the one hand and to reduce the risk of reoffending others. The third one are the identity intervention from the UK. These interventions were designed to address the psychosocial factors influencing an individual's engagement in extremism. It is a voluntary program offered to adults in custody or those on probation in the community. It is delivered by the specially trained psychologists and qualified probation officers. And also the eligibility of this intervention is extended to individuals convicted of terrorism or terrorism-related offenses. However, it is recommended, as I mentioned, only when there are specific psychosocial factors and circumstances that can potentially be addressed through the program. And it does not focus on changing one's ideology or belief, but aims to encourage individuals to re-evaluate their opinions, their views, their beliefs that supported their involvement in extremism. As a conclusion, I would like to mention here at the very beginning, as a concluding remark, that early intervention initiatives and broader prevention efforts holds the potential to proactively deter the onset of radicalization long before security agencies necessitate direct intervention. Recognizing the diverse roles that non-government and civil society actors can play, because in some of these programs, some civil society actors were involved, especially those who worked on providing support in terms of psychosocial support or support after their release from the prison. And also the comprehensive understanding of their underlying mechanisms and efficacy remains incomplete, although there are many evidence suggesting the utility of this program. And also some programs presume that ideology doesn't serve as the sole or primary driver of involvement in violent extremism. As I mentioned, there are many other causes or factors, like push and pull factors for different types of societal or individual or psychosocial factors that influence someone to be radicalized. And here are several recommendations. For example, from a strategic perspective, it is imperative for governments to actively promote and facilitate the systematic exchange of experiences and best practices, not only within their national boundaries, but also on an international scale, in order to see what types of program works better for some context or some countries or some societies, and which can be, let's say, duplicated or replicated, or maybe it can be tailored, made for different types of content. To ensure their effectiveness and to be sure that these types of programs have results afterward, the governments should first establish a system for regular evaluation of these tools, provide a comprehensive training for relevant personnel in their proper implementation, but also to allocate adequate resources to support their full implementation. And here it is important that essential aspect to consider is the primary objective of this tool, which is it centered on disengagement or deradicalization? That's why I started with introducing the concepts of deradicalization, disengagement, or exit, which is very important from the very beginning in order to know where these types of programs need to be focused or directed, let's say. And realistic expectations concerning recidivism and re-engagement rate must also be carefully defined. And let's say if we can address these types of critical questions or these types of recommendations or the conclusion, maybe we can contribute a little bit to the refinement and optimization of risk assessment strategies, first of all, and all the processes related to the assessment and evaluation, and enhancing their overall utility in the context of counterterrorism efforts. The ongoing evaluation and adaptation of the risk assessment tools are crucial to staying ahead of evolving threats and ensuring the efficacy of these types of preventive measures that we follow. Here I would stop. I was within the time frame of 25 to 30 minutes. And I try to give you a brief, let's say, introduction and to explain a little bit the concepts of the deradicalization program. Although the topic is very broad, and I'm aware of that because it includes a lot of European deradicalization programs, and all these countries in Europe, they have their own programs. And as I mentioned, there is no one-size-fits-all approach that can be applicable or implemented everywhere throughout Europe or maybe elsewhere. So that's why it's very challenging, first of all, to create all these programs, then to attract or motivate the prison offenders to also be engaged in this type of programs, but also it's also very, very hard to evaluate and to see the results of these types of programs. Thank you.
So hello everyone again. Just to introduce myself again, Joaquin from the Terrorism Prevention Branch at the United States Office of Drugs and Crimes. I suspect one of the reasons I would like to first thank Ido for the invitation. And as Ido knows, we work, and I personally work on the area of foreign terrorist fighters. Now, at the UNODC, we actually do not work in Europe, with the exception, I guess, of the Southern Eastern Europe. So most of our work is Southern Eastern Europe, for us, is the Balkans, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but that's foreign terrorist fighters not that much relevant to Latin America. So I guess the comments I'm going to make are actually complement a little bit what the paper of Kire, and provide, I guess the main the main objective is probably to provide you a more or a different and more expansive way to look at these issues beyond Europe. Okay. Now, the comments I have are, there are only a few about the paper. I provided Kire with comments about the paper online by email. But actually, I found the paper was quite interesting because, again, it triggered to me all these questions and that I and myself and my colleagues have when working on this area, which mainly had to do with the challenges that we find. Some of them are mentioned by Kire, some of them, because of the scope of his paper, he couldn't really deal with them. I guess the first thing I just wanted to clarify is that at least at the international level, there is some sort of, call it, legal framework dealing with foreign terrorist fighters and their reintegration, and mainly through number of Security Council resolutions, and among other things. But those are the most important ones. Now, with regards to the paper itself, what I told Kire that at least from my perspective, it would have been useful to the extent that the length of the paper allows him to discuss more in depth the national examples that he just discussed now in the body of the paper, and then obviously you will have to sacrifice other segments of the paper because I think that's I find that it's lacking. Like some sort of comparative overview of different experiences, even if it's only Europe, that's fine, and how they differ among themselves. There have been some you mentioned. There are some studies about specific national experiences, but I don't think there's that much in terms of comparative overview. So I think that the paper will benefit from that. The other comments, they don't have that much. They belong to a group of things or thoughts that paper trigger, which I think is important to mention for the audience here in case you want to research this area and just for general awareness. For reasons that had to do with the scope of the paper, Kire had to focus on, or decided to focus on the penitentiary setting. But that doesn't mean that what's happening at the community or in the community settings is not important. We have a lot of our work actually has to do with what happens in the community settings after people run their, they're incarcerated and they're released. But also, so that's one reason why it's important. Let's not forget these people are all relatively young, so they will spend most of their life outside of prison rather than inside. But it's also important for two other groups, which are children and women, which maybe in Europe, I'm not sure it's less relevant, but in the countries where we work, this is a huge issue. Women and children are generally not prosecuted in other countries outside of Europe, which also raises a whole number of issues in terms of how to deal with them. Just as an example, we, at least at not only at UNODC, but at the UN level, in terms of children, our position is that children are, even though children who might have been involved even in violent acts, are victims of terrorism rather than terrorists. And with women, it depends. There's a whole discussion about women and gender assumptions that you should not consider them as terrorists or you should consider them as terrorists. Goes beyond the comments I want to make. and it's also not something that Kire is addressing in his paper because it's beyond the scope. But I thought it would be important for you to know that there's a lot of discussion at the level of the international community on these issues. Now, on the issue of prison settings, before I forget, UNODC has at least a couple of guidelines dealing with managing violent extremist prisoners, violent extremist prisoners. So if you're interested on this issue, I invite you to visit our website, and if you cannot find it, you can always contact. The other, when I was listening to you, Karen, right now, I was also thinking about, and you do mention that in your paper, this, the difficulty in assessing successfulness of these programs. When talking about our work, you can imagine it's even more challenging as a UNODC person, because we actually, when we provide technical advice on this specific issue, we look at what European countries have done. But we don't really, we're going to other countries and we're telling them, look, this is what they're doing in Europe, but we actually don't know whether this is effective or not. So it's a very challenging area to work on, as opposed to perhaps other areas that we work on. Now, the other challenges that we find less so in Europe, and again, we don't talk about that because it's not that much relevant, is an issue of resources, both financial resources, to go to non-European countries or and tell them, this is what they're doing in Europe, whatever, they look at us like, we have no money here for this. It's totally irrelevant for us. So there's an issue of money, but there's also an issue also of human resources. You mentioned that now in your presentation and in your paper, this is just one example, psychological or psychiatric or psychological support. Which is something that has only been started to be looked at with a delay. They started in other countries outside of Europe. They look at this, what we call foreign terrorist violence returnees. They look at them and they say, okay, well, we need to provide them. Sometimes there's an employment component. There is reintegration, rehabilitation. There's a lot of use that we don't mention that much, but again, it's not relevant to Europe, of religious figures in countries, in many of the countries that we work, which are Muslim countries, or Muslim majority countries. So that they do have also a role, an important role. But, for example, going back to the issue of psychological support, we go to places where the resources for psychological support for ordinary situations are lacking. So there's obviously no expertise when it comes to FPF returnees. I actually was working I did a little bit of work on this area with the person here in the UK, sorry. Who actually specializes on that, and we produce some e-learning modules on this. Again, Kire, I can then provide you with a link if you want to take a look at that. Okay, and then the last, or I think it's the last comment that I have, is two. One, it's and mention this because, again, if you are doing research from a UN perspective, for us, it's very important, and I mentioned that to Kire. We need to be careful, not only as Kire, as you mentioned, with the terminology, we need to define it so we know what we're talking about, but also we need to be careful when we talk about extremism and violent extremism and terrorism. For us, it's important because we don't want to encourage a discourse and eventually the prosecution of people who are merely extremists, but not violent extremists. And this is important because in many of the countries where we work, this type of terminology is actually used to prosecute people who should not be prosecuted. And again, I'm mentioning this because it's an issue which goes beyond your paper, more for the audience than for you. And I think the last one is the issue about the involvement of civil society. Again, not always possible in many countries because the space given to civil society is very narrow, and or because there's just lack of trust in civil society and the government, and they're just not going to work together from both ways. So that's also challenging, but it's super important. It's super important. I agree with you, Kire, to do involve civil society. Give me 1 second. I think that's. I mean, there's more, but I think it's not enough in terms of commentaries. Yeah. I think I'm gonna stop now. We let the audience say whatever they want to say, and maybe I can add something else.
Okay. Thank you for that. So now we open the floor for more comments, questions, suggestions around the table.
Yes.
If you want to, just let me know. I will write you on my list.
For me, only the methodological questions. Journals are becoming radical when it comes to methodology, and for me, it was not entirely clear. Firstly, how did you measure progress? Was there any specific time frame in which you said, okay, during this time, we evaluated these measures and we can say that there is a progress? How do you define this progress? And the second one, as far as I understand, but it was not clear from reading your paper, is it a comparative study or is it like rather a sample of Dutch, Norwegian and UK cases to measure the progress of the radicalization? That's only the question. I didn't really understand what did you wanted to measure and which countries. You mentioned European countries, and I believe this is a fantastic job to be published. It has to be published, but maybe these methods you could explain better.
Yes. Thank you. Maybe I started too ambitious when I was firstly drafting the paper, and I wanted to include as many European countries as possible. But also I faced with some challenges or limitations. Let's say not most of them are accessible or available. So in some cases you need to use, let's say, the secondary literature like resources. So there was one study to study on 10 European countries already done, and also then trying to find some best practices or recommendations from their studies and also compare with another ones. I try to briefly explain these three countries because I found them like useful also for other concepts and also interesting. But yes, as I mentioned, that study that was done on 10 European countries, that was very comprehensive and done, I think, by some organization with big research team who delved deeply into all these deradicalization programs. So maybe I will try to make some a comparison between some of them in order to narrow the approach, not to include all of them. And when it comes to the progress, also that's very interesting question and also important and relevant one, which was also identified by other experts in the field. First of all these programs are relatively new. They were introduced let's say, in the last decade. Some of them are like the last 7 years ago, or maximum 15 years ago, which means that they are also new for all the countries, but also new for the theory, for the experts in these fields, and so on. Some of them suggest that the progress needs to be if the prisoner offenders later on, when they are freed, if they don't commit another crime. But also that's because it's tricky and risky, which depends on if it's the same crime or similar crime or maybe completely other type of crime. Also, it's hard or challenging to follow the people after they are released, and to see if they did or not any type of crime, which is also very hard for the other evaluations done before, but also for the country for implementing these programs. It's also hard for them to follow all these persons after they are released from prison. And also, each number of the prisoner offenders, they're still in prison. So we don't know if they will commit another crime after they are released. So now all the evaluation and assessment done to all these programs were mostly focused on the interviews with the prison staff, with the people, with the staff involved in the implementing of these types of strategies for intervention, and how they are perceiving the change in the prisoner offender, change in their beliefs, in their views, in their opinions, and so on. Maybe they are sometimes acting like there is a change in order to have some benefits within the prison. No, for example, I don't know, if they have good behavior and show that they manifest some changes in their opinions, in their views, in their beliefs, they will have some benefits in prison. So that's also a challenging question and issue, and maybe need some time in order to see the benefits or the results of all these programs, and maybe later on we can have a better or clear picture.
Yeah, but what I mean is also that if you focus only on prisons, it would be difficult to see or capture the outliers that this theory, the radicalization programs impacted the behavior of this particular individual from the entire environment in the prison that is specific to all the population there.
Yes, when we're talking about the prison, but what after they are released, when they go into society, what means to be good reintegrated into the society, what means good rehabilitation, and so on. That also depends on the context of the country. So it's not the same in the, let's say, Balkans or Western Balkans countries, or the Western European countries, or somewhere in Nordic countries. So it depends on the context and so on. Big number of these violent extremists or FTFs will soon be released from the prison, because more or less the sentences for their crimes were about, let's say, between 7 to 10 years, depends on the country, depends on the types of crime or how serious was it. So many countries expect that soon they will be released, they will be free in the states, in the society. So maybe then we can see the real and we can measure the real progress, or to see the real results of these types of programs wherever they are. But for example, in many Western Balkan countries, these types of rehabilitation programs they actually don't exist, which means the prison offenders are involved in the general rehabilitation programs within the prisons. Yeah.
Austria, yes.
Yes, thank you. So thank you very much for your presentation. which was very interesting because it's very sociological, criminological, so it's not really my area of expertise. But I have two questions, I think, that were prompted. You once mentioned that the de-radicalization programs are more successful when they're being done voluntarily, and I think everybody can relate to that. But what about forced programs? So you mentioned that sometimes it's part of a prison or of a sentence, of a court sentence, that people need to undergo a de-radicalization program. How would that work? And also, are there any other reasons that people would be required to go undergo such a program? I don't know, have certain prisons programs on their own, and there's no escape from going through that. So that would be my one of my questions. And the second one is, in how far are religious authorities involved in those programs, and what is the response of the people that undergo the programs? And I mean, if we are talking about Islamic extremists, in how far could you address those issues from a religious perspective, which might be seen as, I don't know, mainstream and not understanding the true nature of Islam? Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, about the obligatory involvement of the prison offenders within these programs. I don't have much information about that. I mean, how, what is the progress, or what are the results of these types of intervention. Why? Because the de-radicalization programs means long-term process. Also, even if they are in a voluntary basis, also it needs a lot of time in order to build trust between the prisoner and also the people involved in implementing these types of programs, let's say. Sometimes many people are involved, for example, from different perspectives and different, say, maybe institutions within the penitentiary institution, with different backgrounds, like psychiatry, psychosocial, psychologists, the social workers from the prisons, and so on. So I really don't know how this works when they are obligatorily involved in these types of programs. Yeah.
Just a follow-up on that issue, very, very briefly. In prison settings, you cannot really, force this on someone. It's not going to work, and it's not going to work at the end of the day, but also it's just impossible. It's just, the person is not going to show up to talk to whoever, right? So in prison settings, you can only encourage people to do that. And I guess, that you refer to that, you would do that if you think, if you have trust on the other person who's providing the service, and or because you want to get out earlier, or you want to get benefits, whatever. At the process of release, if there's a court order or whatever, the court will not be able to impose a radicalization or de-radicalization program on the prisoner. It has to be an agreement. Part of the order has to be that, there was a discussion with the lawyer for the person, and, there was a previous discussion, and, he said we usually say he. The accused will say, okay, fine. As part of the release, I will, engage in whichever program it is. Again, it could be because the person is really interested in that, and he probably already has started that process in prison setting, or because he's pretending to.
Yeah. But then in the end, there are no mandatory programs. The programs are never forced on people because they will not work. So it's all voluntary. And then the question is just whether it's really their free will, or they do it because of a certain benefit.
Depends on or both.
Yeah.
In the Netherlands, it's partially mandatory, but because you discussed this particular program, and next to my regular work, I also sit as a judge occasionally in the Netherlands, so I know the system well, but it can only be you refer to it as the Dutch probation service, and they can only work prior to a conviction, and then it's on a voluntary basis to cooperate, but generally the suspects are quite happy to then work together with the Deradicalization because they'll write a report that will be submitted at trial, and then on that can impact on the sentence. So then, in order for the probation service to have a mandate, then it has to be at least part of the sentence has to be a suspended prison sentence or an entirely suspended sentence, and then the condition for that suspension is that they have to cooperate with the probation service for a certain, just any kind of condition can basically be set. It's very free to set those conditions, but they have to be advised by the probation services. So the judge or judges will set certain conditions as part of the sentencing, which could include like a deradicalization program or cooperating with the deradicalization at a certain time. And it could, and that's new because normally it only starts once then the prison, the non-suspended part of the prison sentence is served, and then you get, during the period of the suspended part, you have this mandatory cooperation with the probation services, because if you don't, then you're going back to prison for the suspended part. So that works in that sense, but the difficulty is that if it's a long sentence, it may only start after let's say you got 8 years of regular prison sentence, 2 years of suspended sentence, then it will only start after 8 years. And the ability to work already prior to the end of the initial sentence is relatively new. In that regard, I had a couple of comments on thoughts that come from your paper. I was wondering, you talk specifically about prison sentence, so it's after conviction, and given that a trial can last a long time, I was wondering if there are also programs prior to that stage that can be commented on, or which can be looked at. But also one thing that you do not look at is the potentially radicalized persons that are not subject to a criminal trial. As Joaquin already indicated, in some places there's a series of, or the women, for example, returning from ISIS territory would not be prosecuted. There's now, at least in the Netherlands, a large chunk of women who have been brought back pursuant to court orders, and that's the same, of course, in a number of European countries now. So I assume that there will be more of those trials, where I can imagine that it will, because the programs were initially focused on men. Now you get all these women who are now starting to serve prison sentences. So it might be interesting to look at that, and if there's potentially different programs, but also and that the scope of your paper won't necessarily allow for it, but just by way of comparison, to at least say a few things on programs that relate to those who are not imprisoned, and whether those are potentially more successful or less. That's at least in terms to assess the successfulness of these programs, it's useful to maybe put it next to other programs with a similar nature to avoid and that doesn't necessarily only have to relate, of course, to what you refer to as foreign fighters, but there are many other programs that relate to persons to avoid further crime, and the successfulness of that is not necessarily that high generally. So to understand the potential success of these programs, I think it's good to put it into context of general probation programs and programs that avoid further crime after release. So yeah, well, just to place a bit in context. Joaquin already mentioned something on terminology. I was like wondering, because in your title you talk about foreign terrorist fighters, but you can have, of course, foreign fighters which would not necessarily qualify as terrorists because they might fight for a entity that is not qualified as terrorist, or persons who in some form join a entity that is considered to be a terrorist organization yet are not fighters. For example, the women that would live in ISIS territory, and they. So I wonder whether, the type of conviction, whether what you want to look at only relates to those who are necessarily convicted for terrorist-related offenses, or whether it's the concept of a foreign fighter, which I think is not necessarily the same. Then I had one other comment which I wrote. You talk about the three categories of regimes of convicted terrorists, and I was wondering if there's something similar in relation to those prior to that could be a long period, and it might be just interesting, even if only in kind of a footnote, or just to reflect on if the regime necessarily changes only after conviction, or if there's a different, how the regime would be prior to it.
Okay, thank you. Yes, what you said is the final point. But it depends. I mean, these offenders are not sentenced to the prison, let's say. So they're kept in other custodial institutions, and there are different types of, let's say, settings, context, and behavior there. So the state authorities must take this into account in order to isolate them, or rather disperse them into these types of buildings and so on. But as I mentioned, for example, in my country, there are different types of rules which are not the same as in the prison setting when they're in custodial, but it's everywhere like that. And why the FPS for terrorist fighters? Because it is a narrow approach, let's say, so not this broader approach of foreign fighters, which is a broader concept. And especially when together with my colleagues last year, when we were researching and exploring about the foreign terrorist fighters in our country, it was easier, let's say, because we tried to include the prisoners sentenced only and accused and also convicted only for the crime which is described in the criminal code of the country, which says participation in the foreign military, army, parapolice, and so on, which was introduced recently. So that research back that time, we just took them who were sentenced to this type of crime. So it depends on the country to country if they have different types or similar types of crime. Let's say in our country we have only that type of crime. So also that goes back to another point raised by you about these similar types of programs, deradicalization programs, when the trial is still on, which also depends on the custodial officials, let's say the custodial facility and so on. As I mentioned, there are different types of rules or programs for the when they're in the prison setting, but for the custodial usually there is no, because they don't know how much time they will spend in the custody. So that's why maybe it's challenging to develop, to draft these types of plans or programs. And also lack of resources like human resources in the custody. Usually they don't have psychosocial support or, I don't know, social workers, prison staff and so on. But I agree that state officials need to think about what they will do with this type of people when they are also in the custody. And maybe I can go back to the point raised by Astrid about the religious leaders, because we talked there. Yes, in the theory, many theoreticians argue that the religious leaders, similar as the community leaders, need to be involved in these types of deradicalization programs. Why? Especially because the FTS have wrong understanding or wrong interpretation of the religion. So if they start talking and discussing about this, about the religion beliefs and so on with the real religious leaders, let's say, so maybe they will, they will get the real point of the religion and so on. And especially, this is especially in the countries where these FDS are driven by these religious factors, let's say, or if they go to the battlefields because of the religious purpose.
So I want to present a parallel case, maybe just that would help make my questions a bit more apparent. That namely of someone that's addicted to some substance, alcohol, nicotine, whatever. And once out of a rehabilitation program, isolation from the substance is sort of fundamental to like long-term being sober. So, for example, the rehabilitated addict has to be encouraged to avoid that substance or cases where that substance could be experienced at parties, what have you. And recontact with the substance down the line can enable a relapse. That's often worse, sort of in the short term, in terms of destructive effects, than the sort of the past habit of addiction itself. And so, are these sorts of programs that you describe in this paper ineffectual without something like a long-term program that can assist de-radicalized individuals from avoiding extremist propaganda in context where that could be encouraged? Would these sorts of programs, for example, require restrictions on access to social media, or maybe something like engagement with the public square? Or more generally, how does this look sort of far down the line for de-radicalized persons' lives? And as one more sort of addendum to this, given that, then these sorts of long-term preventative measures could only be quantitatively measured or evaluated given sort of a long period of observation. How could officials deliberate about their long-term efficacy and sort of come to an idea of like a best practice measure for making sure de-radicalized former extremists don't relapse, so to say? So whatever of that you want to address, I would be interested.
Yes, about the mentioned before, it is very hard and challenging how to measure the progress of these programs, especially when they are free and when they go out of the prison. It's hard to find them again, to speak with them and so on, because they are free citizens. So if they are willing to discuss about their past and about their current life, about their lifestyle, it would be good. But if not, then you are lacking of information, and you cannot, let's say, measure the progress or measure the actual result. If they commit the same or similar type of crime, and if they go back to the judicial trial, judicial system, penitentiary institution, then you will have, let's say, some data or to quantify the results or the progress. Otherwise, as I mentioned, it will stay only on the interviews, of the perception of the prison workers, of the staff who work on this intervention, and also, if it's possible, let's say, interviews or assessments together with them. For example, in one study that we did last year, we tried to, I mentioned about this to Joaquin before, together with my colleagues, and it was, by the way, funded by the Minerva Center.
And at the same time that those who have been sentenced are about to be released and go back into the society, do we see any influence on states to say, well, we prefer not to even let them back into the state in order to avoid that 10-year later on problem, because we don't know if our program of radicalization is good enough?
Well, they're sentenced to, as I mentioned before, between 5 to 10 years in prison. So I doubt that the state can intervene something here, because once they complete the sentence, so that's it, they're free citizens. So we can just imagine how they will react and how they will behave in the society. Maybe the state will, especially the judicial systems, will think about maybe increasing the sentences in future if they, in the future, they go back to commit the same type of crime or similar type of crime. But however, no, they are free citizens, and yeah, I doubt that the states can do something here. When it comes to the level of how to measure the level of ideology, or how much they accept some certain type of ideology, that's a matter of the assessment, psychosocial and psychiatrist sometimes assessment. Once they start to serve their sentence. And usually this type of assessments is like qualitative. There is no quantifiable measures or levels in order to see how much prison offender is accepted some certain type of ideology. But it's a qualitative matter of describing their whole personality, their social behavior, their beliefs, their opinions, and also depends on the types of the crime that they committed. For example, in Macedonia, there was one guy, Macedonian, who went to the battlefield in Syria, and he was well educated. He was a medical doctor, but who accepted Islam, and he said that according to the Hippocratic Oath, that he's obliged to help his brothers and to go on the battlefield and so on. So,
as a fighter or as a medic?
He said that he went there as a medic. Yeah, so it was a trick, because at the end he was in prison. I don't remember what was how many years he was in prison, but I think that the main arguments were because he had a contact with many of these foreign terrorist fighters, or some religious leaders that were serving as recruiters at that time, and was also in prison later on. So let's say that maybe in this case the level of ideology, or maybe how he accepted was very high.
So it brings back to Joaquin's comment about foreign terrorist fighters. If that guy actually went there and just became a medic, then
yes,
it is a question that needs to turn. Okay. Thank you very much, Kevin.